Hi, I'm Ben Van Duzen, and in this video I'm going to be discussing how we might reframe inequities in student outcomes, specifically thinking about society's educational debts. So one of the reasons we're thinking about this is that one of the QuantCrit tenets is that data cannot speak for itself. And so when we have findings, it's important that we frame them. If we don't frame them, and we just say, oh, the data speaks for itself and don't provide that context, then basically we're allowing those findings to be interpreted through the dominant perspective. And those tend to support deficit narratives and focus on student deficiencies. As opposed to QuantCrit framing, which tends to problematize oppressive structures, and a lot of times we'll take a resources narrative and think about the resources that students bring with them. So let's talk about what that looks like for inequities in student performance, let's say before and after instruction. If we use a dominant perspective, we'll oftentimes hear about unprepared students. You might hear something like, oh, the reason that our minoritized students aren't performing as well in their physics course is because they're coming in not as well prepared in their math. And so this is a deficit of the student. This is something the students are lacking, and it puts the onus of overcoming those barriers on the students themselves and makes it their fault. Sounds as if it is their fault. We'll also often hear gap language. Talks about, oh, well, this group is outperforming this other group, which sounds absolute, and that there's these groups that are just underperforming. As opposed to a QuantCrit framing, we might talk about funds of knowledge. Instead of talking about what students aren't bringing to the class, we can talk about all the resources they are bringing to the class with them. And we can also talk about society's educational debts. And that's really going to be the focus of what I want to talk about here. Society's educational debts are the debts that society owes students due to a lifetime of being denied opportunities and resources that our dominant students and groups have had access to. And so because they've had this lack of opportunity, we see these inequities in their outcomes. And this also places the onus on society to repay those debts as opposed to students to try and overcome them themselves. That it's on society to make these things more equitable. So what does that look like? Let's say you have a course, and before the course you give a pretest. And so in this, we're going to plot advantaged students in orange and marginalized students in blue. And you might see distribution in your pretest scores, where we can see our advantaged students tend to have higher pretest scores than our marginalized students, so there's an inequity. What would often be called an achievement gap, right? There's a difference in their achievement. But that framing again sounds both absolute, where it sounds like, oh, all advantaged students are outperforming all marginalized students. But when we think of it really as a statistical average, we see there's in fact great overlap. But there is some inequity here, right? Like our marginalized students are not performing as well, but this is not due to any fault of their own. We're reframing this as this is because of society's educational debts. This is due to the lack of opportunities and resources that have been denied to them over their lifetime. And so it's our obligation to repay that and close these inequities or get rid of these inequities. So you can imagine then giving these students post-test after class. And in one scenario, we'd see both groups gained from the pre-test to the post-test, with our marginalized groups having larger gains. And here we see that educational debt that society owes students got smaller. In fact, it basically went away in this case. So this would be a case where the course mitigated educational debts and by repaying a bunch of those, at least on this measure. We could imagine another course where both groups gain the same amount over the period of the semester. And here we'd say this perpetuated educational debt. One might say, oh, it's equitable because everyone gained the same amount. But all we're doing is maintaining the debts that are owed students, right? We haven't paid any of it, and it is our obligation to help close these deficits and repay the debts. So this would be a class that perpetuates those educational debts, and we can imagine other classes might exacerbate them. Here we see our advantaged group having larger gains than our marginalized groups, and these educational debts get even larger. We've exacerbated them. So, all right, thank you so much in thinking about this framing, and I hope you find it useful.